do launch into, I should acknowledge country. I would like to acknowledge that I'm meeting you from the lands of the Wadawurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, particularly as a non-Indigenous woman. So I guess, yeah, my background is in nursing. I started off in paediatrics, but I also at the same time had a bit of a part-time role in the community setting, so working in general practice. And although I loved paediatric nursing, I found it a little bit challenging, particularly because a lot of it was, we were working with the Department of Health and Human Services a lot on cases that were really quite sad. Because I was having children myself, I found it a bit overwhelming. So I moved more into the community space. From there, started also working in Aboriginal health services. A few years into doing that, I got approached by a university to go and teach some units over at the, what we then called the Indigenous, or the Institute of Koori Education, which, so Koori is the New South Wales people and the Victorian peoples that are Indigenous. So I started teaching in those units for just with Indigenous nurses, which I loved. Yeah, it was fantastic. And in doing so, I got to go to a lot of Indigenous countries throughout Australia to watch students and support students while they're on their clinical placements in hospitals or in community centres and so forth, and realise how much I was invested in Indigenous health and how much I loved it. So since then, although I am now teaching in mainstream nursing, I call it mainstream, so I don't specifically work one-on-one with the Indigenous students. My focus now is on teaching about Indigenous health to the mainstream students, so that they are a little bit more culturally prepared and working in safe and appropriate manners. The family violence thing, I've always had a bit of an interest in it. There's, some exposure myself as a young person, but I have been doing volunteer roles in family violence for nearly 20 years. Someone from the Indigenous community approached me and spoke to me with a few others from the community about the fact that they were worried that a lot of their peoples were not able to access the right kind of support that they needed for family violence. And because at the time I was a chair of a family violence organisation, they approached me in that role, and also because I'd worked as a nurse in the Indigenous community, and it all kind of stemmed from there. We just decided let's actually do some work in this area. So that's where it all kind of comes from. So and how about you?
It always starts with community asking you, because they trust you, can you do this for us? Because it'll be a good fit. And then,
that's right. And I think that, if I hadn't have already been working in the community as a nurse and also as an educator, I don't think I would have built enough of a rapport with the people that they would have felt that they could trust me. But it did mean a lot to me when I was approached. Yeah.
You need to have those relationships. You work in a really sensitive area, family violence. Yeah. There's a lot of trust that needs to be built up there. That's in 2015, I started this program called Women Warriors, and it's focused on Indigenous women's health, because I ran a half marathon for Team Diabetes because my dad became an insulin dependent type 2 diabetic. And then I was in the community and I saw that there wasn't a lot of Indigenous women like at the health facilities, or even when I ran the half marathon, there wasn't a lot of Indigenous participants. And I just realized that there was such a gap in the system for culturally relevant Indigenous health programs. And I just started it purely as a volunteer. So I was a mom with 3 kids under the age of 5 when I started doing it. And it was just like at the local friendship centers, what they're called here. They're for like urban Indigenous people to gather and to be in a culturally safe space. And they have programming there for them.
And, wow, I haven't heard of friendship centers.
They're nationwide, all across Canada.
Yeah, okay.
And they're for urban Indigenous people to connect. So anyway, I started it as a volunteer, and I ran it as a volunteer for many months before I ever got paid to do it. And I just asked all these fitness instructors if they would volunteer their time to come and teach different kinds of fitness. And after that, we had a nutrition education circle for 10 minutes, and it was like really simple messaging. Then we had a round circle discussion afterwards where we just talked. I ran that program from 2015 to 2018 in this area. I decided that I wanted to go back to university to pursue my degree so that I could become my own Indigenous health researcher.
Yep, good.
I had about 16 courses left to finish my degree. I've done it all long distance. And this semester is my very last course, and I graduate in June. Yes. So
wonderful. Congratulations. That's good.
It's been 4 years in my basement by myself, just pounding away. I really love what I do. So I started to do my own research projects. So I went out, found my own funding. You know, during this time, like you said, when you start to work in community or you work with women and you build that rapport and that trust, and they start to come to you with their issues. And
yes.
You know, for me, it was like they were having a lot of problems accessing culturally relevant services, and then also a lot of problems with the healthcare system. I knew about digital storytelling, and I knew that I would be good at it. Like I just am naturally inclined to technology and storytelling, and like my dad, like an amazing storyteller. And I mean, if you're in Indigenous communities, you just know how to tell stories anyway. You're always listening to stories, right?
Yeah.
I went ahead and did this digital storytelling project over 2 summers in my undergrad degree, which was really like a master's thesis. Like it was intense.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so I have the digital stories on my website, but I'm really interested in more like cultural safety, which is also what I see in your research as well. Hearing from community that they want to have cultural safety in the services that they access, but a lot of the questions that I get is like, how do we build these programs, or what do we do to create culturally safe environments?
Yes.
I'm interested in talking that about, because I do have all your papers right here. I'm really interested in ethical research, co-creating with Indigenous people, because it takes a lot of time and patience and trust and reciprocity. I think being an ethical Indigenous health researcher is very challenging. Those are the 2 topics that I'm interested in talking about today. And
cool.
I just wanted to make sure if there's anything that you want to get out of this conversation before we really start to get into it. Is there anything that you want to talk about?
I guess towards the end, we could talk about, you know, whether maybe between the two different regions, whether we can start to generate a discussion about what is cultural safety, because a lot of people say that they want it, and a lot of people say that they practice it, but I don't think anyone's very good at actually describing it. Yeah. So I think, you know, we need to do a lot more in the way of articulating what cultural safety means for Indigenous peoples, and also how that cultural safety might be different for other people from other cultures. Because, you know, quite often when I hear people speak and they talk about cultural safety, they lump Indigenous peoples with culturally and linguistically diverse peoples, and it's all about being safe for everyone, and it should just be cultural safety for everyone.
What you're talking about is like a pan-Indigenous approach to cultural safety, which I don't believe there is. Like I think it has to be very narrowed down into what you believe. So I'm really interested in that, and because cultural safety is something that every university is trying to enact right now in all of these different systems, and I think it's a very complex thing to do. And I love that you just told me that, because I don't think that there's a pan-Indigenous anything. You know, when you're talking about like family violence, there's not a pan-Indigenous program that you can just throw out there and expect everyone to respond to it.
Exactly, which is why I worked with one community, because I know one of the challenges that I might get back from my examiners will be, well, you know, why didn't you work with a broader? And it's like, yeah, but there's so many different needs, and there's 250 odd countries, and in every single one of them there is differences, even within that community, you know. So I guess it's about working with one at a time.
I really want to say to you, first off, is congratulations on completing your PhD thesis.
Thank you. That's an understatement. 4 years of absolute intense work, and you know, I really actually didn't in some ways think I'd get it done in the 4 years, and I wouldn't have done if I didn't already have a relationship with the community. But there were other things that kind of, I thought, oh gosh, I'm never gonna get it done now, because there's actually been a lot of suicides in my area lately, but one of them was an Indigenous boy who was involved in my project. I really thought after that, I just can't keep going with this. So I'm really pleased that I did get there in the end, and I know he would be very proud of me that I did too. So
I'm so sorry to hear that. It just gave me bumps, because all the time when we work in community, there's so many heartbreaks that we want to quit, and we hear about all of these hardships, but then at the same time you just said something really powerful, which was he would have been really proud of me for completing this. So that's also his legacy as well, being part of your project.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm really interested in knowing COVID. How many people are infected? Like, Australia is doing so much better than
we are doing amazing.
Yes. What are you going to do for your research plan, like upcoming, in these next few months? Because it's going to take a while to vaccinate everyone. And it's not like you want to risk Indigenous communities by entering them. And then at the same time, relationships are so important for Indigenous health research. How is COVID affecting you, and what is your plan for research?
Yeah, so look, a lot of the first half of this year for me is going to be doing a lot of, my literature reviews for my upcoming projects and stuff. There is one project that I might be looking at doing face-to-face interviews before mid-year, and that is actually a perpetrator project. I'm going to be working with perpetrators of digital abuse, actually. Not specifically Indigenous peoples, though I hope to recruit Indigenous peoples into that space. But yeah, we've been celebrating donuts, which is zeros, for a while. And we're very lucky, but that actually took such strict, like we literally were pretty much housebound for a while. Everything kind of shut down. You don't only leave your house for supermarket stuff, although most people were getting deliveries. Some hardware shops were allowed to open. Some, most medical stuff was all done online. It was a really rigid lockdown. There was no cafes open or anything. So, and it was for a fair amount of time, not just for 5 or 7 days. We did it for about 2 months. So yeah, that's how we've got to the space where we are. But I think I'm going to be okay. As I said, the only face-to-face stuff I should be doing in the first half of this year, and hopefully we'll all be vaccinated by mid-year, will be that perpetrator stuff.
The research that you just published on and you did your PhD thesis on, you never could have done that during COVID times, or do you think you could have adapted it to online?
I just really feel that there's already so much mistrust from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people towards research that being in a room with someone is just, it's necessary. And also, the yarning circles, I call them focus groups because I'm a non-Indigenous person, but my Aboriginal community advisory group call them yarning circles. We couldn't do them. We wouldn't have been able to do them in a COVID world. So it's really important, the sense of, whenever we started a yarning circle, everyone would share who their mob were and all that kind of stuff. What their background was and stuff. And, once you do that and you actually get that feeling in the room that everyone can trust each other and that there's going to be a good discussion today, it just really just allows everything to flow. And I can't imagine doing that to the extent that you would be able to online. It just wouldn't work as well.
Yeah. So, it's like that sense of spirit between the group too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really hard, but I'm really interested in doing decolonized spaces online, and what does that look like for Indigenous people, and how do you build that sense of trust even though it's online? Even though I've never met you in person and we've never met before, I feel very comfortable talking to you.
Yeah.
So I really feel like there can be that sense of trust and relationship online, but it needs to be done with particular people and in a certain way. Even before I started today, I cleaned up my room. I smudged, I have my crystals.
Oh, good.
Like I kind of build myself into it. So like I have an open heart when I come to a conversation.
Yep.
Because otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Being open to what the conversation is. I've done digital storytelling online. It was with a master's student, so she had a high level of digital literacy, and it worked really well. For what I did before, my past 2 summers of research, I don't think I could have done it online. There needs to be a high level of digital literacy, and then on top of that, there can't be that internet connection divide. Like some remote communities just wouldn't have the ability to be online like this and Zoom.
And that's right, that digital divide. I mean, you know, we're fairly lucky here, but there are still some rural areas where it is an issue. Also, affordability is an issue too. So, you know, a lot of people actually can only use the internet if they're down at the shops where they might be able to get some free Wi-Fi and stuff. So, yeah, I guess, but it's interesting what you said about who it works for. I think, you know, if you've got people who are willing and they want to be there, then that's great. I know from teaching in the online space, and, you know, all of our students were just thrown into it. They didn't get a choice. You know, they didn't want to be there. They wanted the traditional lecture style. They wanted to be in a room with us, and then they just didn't really want to engage. And so, you know, it's about wanting to be there and being invested in that.
I'm getting really good at building relationships online because I've had to. I mean, and it wasn't in a classroom setting. I think that's different when there's like just a teacher lecturing, but just like building relationships like this. Part of the reason I wanted to have a chat with you is because every year I pick a word that I'm going to center my life around. And this year the word is connection.
Excellent word to choose.
Yes. And so I feel the year 2020 was about disconnection and being out of balance. You know, COVID has really taught us that we're out of balance with nature, with Mother Earth, the capitalist system, and the inequities. This year, I really want it to be about connection and like, how can we help each other and how can we build a better system back? And what does it look like to be virtually connected? And can you have a really good, strong relationship online?
Absolutely, it can be, if that's people's choice to be. And I think that's one of the great things that I found in my PhD, that, you know, like there was so many people that said to me, "Oh, Indigenous peoples aren't going to use an online resource." Well, in fact, they were encouraging and they wanted one because it afforded them a safety that they didn't get in other ways. So, you know, it's all about exploring, are people ready to go into that space? And for those that are, it's a great space, you know. But yeah, I'm really pleased that you're going to focus on connection. I think I need to too. I also need to focus on connecting to country and just to getting my feet back in the sand, and, you know, and just a bit more grounding. So yeah.
So do you participate in ceremony then, or how does that work as a non-Indigenous researcher?
As a non-Indigenous person, you don't actually really participate in ceremony unless, like, if there's a smoking ceremony, you can go up and cleanse yourself in the smoking, and, you know, but it's more of an observation role than participation role when it comes to the ceremonies. All proceedings with ceremony of some sort, or if it's just a meeting, every meeting starts with an acknowledgement. But if it's something like, say, when we were presenting the results from this report, you know, there was a smoking ceremony for a cleansing. Then there was a welcome to country by a traditional owner, and then there was some dancing by some of the youth. There's always those kind of ceremonies for anything that's kind of big news or whatever. But if it's just meetings, it's acknowledgement to country, or if there's a traditional owner there, it's welcome to country. So yeah, and I love a good welcome. You know, I feel unsettled if it hasn't been done. So and everyone in my workplace and all my volunteer things, they're sick of me saying, "Hey, no one's acknowledged country yet." So yeah,
it's part of your ritual and the beginning of doing things in a good way.
Absolutely.
Before I start talking about your research, I really appreciate how you've put something really important in your research paper, which I don't see a lot. This one is Indigenous Perspectives on Using Technology as a Supportive Resource When Experiencing Family Violence. And then one of the subtitles is Strengths. And then under here you say the study was undertaken because the community identified that they needed alternative approaches for family violence. You listed all the strengths of this research, and I was like, good for you.
Thank you. Thank you. But I think also just that it is time that we started writing in that strengths kind of narrative rather than, situating everything to do with Indigenous health or Indigenous life in the deficit narrative that's just has been dominant for so long. It's really going to take a conscious effort because, of course, one of the things that you want to do when you're, say, writing an article or you're trying to engage an audience is you want them to see why it's so important that we do the work. So that's when you tend to use all the awful statistics or, all that real deficit narrative. It's about trying to switch that up, but making sure people are still engaged. It's hard also as an author of a paper to say, hey, I did something well. You feel a bit like, oh, look at me.
I know, but I appreciate this as an Indigenous health researcher because I was like, exactly what he's doing is what we all need to do, which is always examine.
It should be standard.
Yeah. And so you talk a lot about deficit narratives in Indigenous health research in your work. But I also see that you're trying to make real changes when you talk about it by, talking about the strengths of it. And then the other thing that I really like is that you talk about your focus groups and the community that you work with as co-creators in your research. Their names are included. And I think that's so important as well, where, we're acknowledging that it's their knowledge and they are the co-creators of this knowledge. And we really need to step aside and have a lot of humility and not say, this is only my work. This is what I
And look, there was one point of the PhD where it got to the point where my supervisors had said to me, if you keep on acknowledging everyone else's contribution, you're going to have to defend your own. And I was like, I am happy to go there because, it is important. I guess what I've seen for the last couple of decades when people think that they're doing co-design or co-creation is that people more talk the talk, they don't walk the walk. And so there is a lot of people that are actually claiming to be doing that work and they're not at all. So they might engage in having an advisory group or something like that who oversees maybe just something as simple as ticking off the methods that they've already chosen. And it shouldn't be like that. It should be that Indigenous peoples are actually there from the beginning. They're identifying the problem. They're saying, this is our problem, so this is how we want to address it. These are the methods that we want to use. This is what we feel is comfortable. And then they should be involved in the analysis. It's so rare to actually see Indigenous peoples involved in analysis of their own work. And it's crazy. It actually drives me a little bit nuts that we don't have that, because if we're trying to gain Indigenous perspectives, but then there's no Indigenous lens on the interpretation or the construction of what it means, then what are we doing?
Especially when traditional languages and concepts are involved, because you don't know what those words mean. You're not really sure. How can you analyze or put something in a theme when you're not totally sure what the whole concept means?
Absolutely, yeah. And when you say that, I don't even think it's about Indigenous languages, because in fact, a lot of people here, and going back to what I said about most people here aren't traditional owners, so they don't know Wadawurrung language and they don't use Wadawurrung language. They predominantly just use English. But it's the little things like mum is your bum, or, things like just some of the slang that they use. If you don't even understand that. And one thing that I've tried to write about, but I can inherently never truly understand, is shame from an Indigenous perspective, because shame is so very, very different. And as a non-Indigenous researcher, just knowing that I don't truly understand it means that I shouldn't be the person that's doing all the interpretation of everything that's being said about.
A lot of your research talks about shame. That's a lot of the themes that you pulled out from family violence was about the shame of it. And then the other thing that I really noticed, and I'm glad that you brought this up, that this isn't a concept that you can totally understand because you're not in that position of, having that intergenerational trauma and being ashamed of who you are as a person.
Exactly.
That came up in my digital stories as well, where, you're just ashamed of even identifying as an Indigenous person at all. I thought this was really interesting too, and this is in your article on Indigenous Perspectives on help seeking for family violence, voices from an Australian community, talking about there's a pressure within families and community to avoid anything that may cause shame or to expose any kind of family issues that would bring shame. And then I thought this quote was really telling. There's always pressure. Don't show non-Indigenous people that we're weak by asking for help for this. Keep it internal. Don't hang out the dirty washing was one of the sayings I used to come across when we talked about this sort of stuff. And that's the stuff that I come across as well.
Yep. That's it. There is no way that someone like me or any other white fella can ever truly understand what it's like to experience that trauma and to then have to make decisions based on the fact that you're always trying to avoid that shame. When I speak to non-Indigenous peoples about shame, they go, oh yeah, they're embarrassed. That no, this has nothing to do with embarrassment at all. It is nothing like embarrassment. Embarrassment is so superficial compared to shame that someone inherently feels, and it really dictates a lot of the actions that they take, not only in help seeking, but just in everyday life. So it's something that we probably should explore further, but we have to be so very careful in exploring something that causes such pain. How do we gently move into that space and appropriately work out how we can address shame without causing harm in doing so? So that's something for us to work on, isn't it?
It is. And it's such a tough subject. And even within my own Indigenous health research, it was really devastating for me, the amount of trauma that I had to work through when I was talking with everyone. And then, just overcoming that shame can be a lifelong journey. It's not something that I can help with a month of digital storytelling research. It's huge. And then on top of that, there's a lot of trust involved in admitting all the shame that you carry inside. It's building those relationships and then teaching other people how to hold space. I think as an Indigenous health researcher, one of the skills that I talk about, learning how to hold space for people, just hearing their story without any kind of judgment and without them feeling any more shame for telling you what had happened to them. It's a hard skill to learn unless you've been through your own kind of trauma and had to recover from it.
Yes. Yep. I completely agree. Yeah. Yep. And I think that for a lot of the Indigenous peoples of Australia anyway, I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, in some ways a bit of an acceptance that shame will always be there. And that creates a barrier in itself to ever being able, will there ever be recovery? Will there ever be moving on and finding the strength, I guess, to overcome the shame that really was caused by other people.
I just want to delve a little bit into your research because
sure.
So I'm really interested in doing a family violence awareness prevention app. I don't have any funding. It's just an idea that I have, and I wrote about it in my newsletter. When I did my literature review, I came across your article, and then it says it's essential that Indigenous people have access to culturally appropriate family violence support programs and resources. I came across your website, which is an amazing website, which I'll link to in our chat so people can go look at it. The first thing that I want to talk about when I looked at this website, it was all pictures of the land. I really love that.
You're talking about the Burndawan, which was the co-design with the Wadawurrung community. Yeah, so that was something that the community felt very strong about. They said that for an online resource to be something that would be usable and safe and so forth, they needed to connect to their land. So there was a lot of images from the land. There's a meditation in there that has background from the local waterfall, and of course there's Indigenous art by a local artist. So there are a lot of attempts to have people connect with country and with culture throughout the resource.
So you co-created that website with the Indigenous community.
Yes,
And they told you what to put on that website.
Yes, that's right. So
That's
when
amazing.
it comes down to things like, some of the family violence content, that was more our side of things, although every single thing, all of the content in it was approved by the Aboriginal Community Advisory Group before it was put on the site. But they were very much responsible for telling us what was to go in there, and also their voices are there and the storytelling that's on there, and the healing section in particular, which they said that if we didn't have a healing section, don't bother with a site. And I thought that was very important to capture that. They are really the main, without the community actually working on that healing section, it wouldn't have come together. But it is all about their ideas, their images, their voices informing that section of the site.
What kind of healing resources are on there that you would say are like the culturally appropriate resources just for that community?
For that community, I guess the fact that you can hear from elders and from other community members about their stories of survival, or their stories, or even their encouragement. I really like that there's a couple of stories on there of them encouraging people to reach out and talk to others and to use services that are appropriate so that they can begin on their healing journey. There's also some resources on there that aren't specific to the Wadawurrung country. However, they were designed basically for Kuri people, so people of the Kulin nations down here. And so one of them is a strengths assessment that was designed by Graham G, an Indigenous researcher here in Australia. It encourages people to think about what does give them strength. Is it connection to their family? Is it connection to the country or to culture? And how can they use that strength to move forward in the healing space? So I think things like that are really important. And we deliberately don't actually give people a score when they do that assessment, because the actual assessment itself is just to prompt people in their thinking, what does give me that strength? What do I turn to, or what do I know I can do for myself?
Yeah, and there's a real sense of empowerment there because it's resources that you already have internally, or something that's really close that you can already grasp. I was really interested too, because so you have that beautiful website and I really loved it. And I went through all the digital stories, and because I'm a digital, like the methodology that I've used is digital storytelling. I thought it was amazing that you found people that wanted to talk about their own experiences of violence, because that's a very sensitive topic.
On the Safer Families website, so that's separate to the one that was co-designed by the Wadawurrung community, which is called Burndawan. But the Safer Families website has two digital storytelling projects on it. One of them is women who are sharing their experiences and their thoughts and feelings around those experiences, and perhaps even things that triggered them, or it can be things that perhaps made them realize that they're in an abusive relationship, which is often quite hard to realize. And another section is some stories about the experiences of children. So Dr. Laura Tarzia and Dr. Katie Lamb have been instrumental in bringing those stories together. But I think digital storytelling is just such an important method moving forward in really exploring our understanding of people's experiences. And from a researcher, I mean, I guess I see myself as a bit of an interpretivist, or, perhaps there's some borderline into constructivism as well. But, to actually really construct and interpret meaning, we need those stories. Yeah, and to actually hear full stories from people, not just quotes or snippets here and there, is essential in us really learning.
Yeah. And it's a holistic way of approaching a situation, as opposed to, when I look in your academic articles, it's so important that we have quotes, but again, just a little snippet doesn't do it justice.
Yeah,
you need to have
that's
a
right.
holistic picture of someone.
It's so true. And if you had have seen my first iterations of all of my articles, there would be big snippets and I'd be explaining the person and my supervisors would be like, cutting everything out and leaving just 2 lines. That's what you have to do for the submission of academic articles, unfortunately. But It's been great to actually have people, when we present at conferences and stuff, if I can have an Aboriginal person there with me who's actually talking to some of those quotes and explaining some of those quotes, that's lovely to be able to do.
There should be a new format and a new way of doing Indigenous health research where we can have academic, but then we can insert digital stories in there instead of just quotes. It should be more multimedia, and it should be more in their own voices as opposed to me speaking for them all the time. That's what I like about digital storytelling. I don't want to be the spokesperson. I want them to do it themselves and advocate for their own healthcare needs.
Yes.
So I think that's such an important, empowering part of it. And for a lot of Indigenous women, it's just too hard for them to come to a conference. I would love to take them to every conference that I could. They have family obligations and they have work and some of them are really shy and I don't know, able to stand up there and speak. I think that doing something digitally and then inserting it in a thesis and then always having digital stories on hand where you're hearing from the people, I think that's such an important part of ethical Indigenous health research.
I think you're completely right. And as a nurse and with nursing students, I know that they learn better if they're hearing a story. And I think it facilitates knowledge translation when you can actually think about the fact that, I've applied that to a situation because I've heard about that. Yeah, it's just more effective. I realize we've only got 10 minutes or so till the next meeting, so I'm just going to let you ask your questions. I'm going to stop interrupting.
So the one, I really like this diagram that you made.
Thank you.
Yes, it's an excellent Indigenous healthcare models for people experiencing family violence. I really liked that you had it in circles and then the Indigenous person in the middle and then cultural awareness, connecting for trust and strengthening safety. I'm going to include that in our video so that people can have a better graphic of it. But I just want you to tell me how you came up with this. What all went into the process of this?
First of all, we knew that there were the three layers of, of basically wanting the safety and so forth and the building of rapport and stuff. What we felt was being lost was that when people were talking about what it is the Indigenous peoples want, they then weren't centering the person and what is meaningful to the person. So even though we have at the middle, we have the Indigenous person, what we actually really mean by that is the Indigenous person and their kin, their community, their country, so all the things that are important to the Indigenous person needs to still stay at the centre, because we don't want people to get lost in the fact that when Indigenous people think about safety and safety within community and culture, that they're not actually inherently a part of that, or that what they care for isn't. So it was about centering that Indigenous person, but then also surrounding them with what is important to them. It is about developing rapport. It is about having a yarn. It is about feeling safe from institutional control. It was about adding layers to how we can actually provide care that is appropriate to the Indigenous person experiencing violence.
So to me, this seems like a cultural safety model right here.
Kind of.
Yeah. Okay. So what you think cultural safety is, or kind of the definition that you've come up with through your research, doing family violence research, what is cultural safety to you?
Oh, wow. I seriously think that that's a hard question to answer, and it should be, because it's different for every single person. So cultural safety is whatever that person perceives needs to occur for them to actually feel safe within a healthcare space. And I am talking about cultural safety in healthcare here, and particularly family violence. But what is important and meaningful for that person? So while there might be, I guess, some things that we need to think about as far as kin and country and stuff, it might also be that some of the connection that we interpret could also be a little bit a part of the problem, because I know particularly in some Aboriginal health services here that are, and predominantly, and they should be run by Indigenous peoples, for someone to actually attend an Aboriginal health service that is loaded with their cousins and their neighbours and the people from their football club. It's where they want to go to feel safe, but there's an unsafety about it because of the fact that everyone will know and they'll be exposed. And, How do we mediate that? I'm not even answering the question by saying this. What is cultural safety to me? I think I'm still yet to understand it. And I'm not ashamed to say that, because if I did perceive that I knew it all by now, then I'd be dangerous as a healthcare professional. And I think I need to be in a spot where I can ask someone what it means to them and just know that whatever they tell me, that's true for them.
And it's like, well, I'm not really sure. I couldn't really tell you, but I'll tell you this. I know when my co-creators, when the people I work, when they feel safe, I know, like for myself, I figure out what makes them feel safe, and I make sure that I enact that behavior all the time.
Exactly. I'm scared by people who do think that they know. And I guess the other thing is, and hopefully it's somehow demonstrated in that model, is that, you need to connect with people and you need to establish the rapport and build the trust so that you can find out what is important to them. And asking is the most important thing you can do. Admitting to someone, I don't understand what your cultural needs are or how they might impact your stay in hospital or your time with us as a service, so how about you tell me what you need? Surely people are going to appreciate that rather than have a healthcare professional that's making an assumption about the way they should behave or the things they should do.
One last question before you go. What surprised you about the process of ethical research on your PhD journey, and you're doing family violence research?
One thing that is a surprise is that Indigenous peoples, for how the great amount of need that they have to feel safe, it is amazing how ready they are to actually share their voice, to share their perspectives, share stories, and that they appreciate that those stories should come from all people, young, old, male and female, in the family violence space. I had a lot of questions and even backlash ethically from non-Indigenous peoples who didn't understand why I wanted to hear from mature minors and who didn't understand why I wanted to hear from men. The thing was, the Indigenous community completely understood why we were going there. They were the drivers behind why we were going there, because it isn't just about hearing the voice of elders. We need to hear from our young who are going to be our next generation of elders. We do need to hear from our men because, there is a priority about keeping connection to kin and so forth in the Indigenous community. And our men, whether they're the perpetrators of violence, they're experiencing the violence, or they even just are aware that it's going on, it affects them too. And that intergenerational trauma just keeps going because we're not addressing it with our men. So I guess one of the things that I found really difficult to grasp was why ethics were giving me so much of a hard time about doing some of this work. But it was for different reasons than what the Indigenous community, they wanted to make sure that the research was actually going to do something tangible for their community in the end. They wanted to make sure that it wasn't just another study that they'd never get to know about the results or have input to the results and things like that. Whereas the ethics committee, I guess and I guess there's a good reason for it, but they're challenging you on things of, well, should you be involving mature minors, because how are you going to make sure that they're safe? And you're talking about a really heavy kind of area. Should you be doing other things to make sure that people are going to be safe in that interview? Of course, we already knew that we were going to be doing everything there anyway. That was something that was a bit of a juggle, and it was a bit of a surprise. And I think that non-Indigenous peoples have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples in regards to the fact that it should be the whole of family, the young, the old, the men, the women.
And I think that there's incongruency with academia and the Research Ethics Board, and then actually going out and doing community-based participatory action research. That's right. We need to get better at getting them all together and getting everybody on the same page. That's part of the reason why I want to connect to all of these different kinds of Indigenous health researchers, is because the Research Ethics Board and what we do in academia makes our work really hard in community. Yep.
That's right. And look, just quickly before we finish up, and I do have to go in a moment because I have another meeting, but I was very, very lucky that two of the funding bodies that I went to They understood community dynamics, and they knew that working with an Indigenous community, there was going to be some lengthy processes to make sure that we did everything right by the community, and that we asked permission from the right people and so forth, and that we involved people appropriately. Whereas I think it's very hard for big organisations that give out funding, and also for ethics committees, to understand the length of time it takes to work appropriately in that space and do things the right way. That's always going to be a bit of a push back and forward.
Thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today.